I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. And all my days I've been held in your hand. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. 'Cause all my life you have been faithful, and all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God.
Hi, this is Christopher Perrín, and I want to thank you for joining me for this particular lecture, Introducing Assessment. It is a lecture entitled A Brief History of Grading, and it will be a brief history. I'm going to hit the high peaks on this topic. It's subtitled From Medieval Mentorship to Modern Metrics. I'm going to give this content in 2 lectures. Part 1, I will deal with the history of grading up to the modern period, and then in Part 2, I will dive in a little deeper into the modern period, where we will look in particular at modern metrics. So, think about this. Don't we always assess? Aren't we assessing beings by nature? Think about how we naturally praise and blame things that are really important, like great works of art or architecture or literature, political speeches that are important. But we'll also praise what we might call the daily or the mundane, like a good cup of coffee. We can note the elements of a good cup of coffee, like those contained in a flat white with an extra shot. If we can praise coffee or blame it and pay careful attention to even the nature of coffee, certainly we can do that with more important affairs like the teachings, say, of mathematics or science, biology, or an art like grammar or rhetoric. Think about the master-apprentice relationship that has characterized so much training in the past. Think about say, a master painter working with a junior painter, the coaching and the mentoring and the ongoing assessment that would be necessary for a master to impart a skill to a junior apprentice. Even that word to direct and correct presupposes that we're going to help an apprentice or a learner or a student to be on the right or straight path, for the Latin word rectus means straight or right. Think of moral rectitude. So there's even kind of moral connotations involving the straight and narrow, the straight life, the good life, conforming ourselves to a standard or a pattern that is considered to be good and a part of learning. And isn't the teacher who can tell when we're deviating, when our line isn't quite straight, when our brush stroke isn't as it should be, and when our touch on the piano keys isn't quite right yet, and will give us the kind of guidance to set us on the path that would lead to mastery. Well, that's the master-apprentice relationship. This has been around since teaching has been around. I would argue it's been around as long as human beings have been around. We are naturally assessing beings. So assessment is a very good thing, and it's a way that we grow. And we want a wise master, a wise teacher, to help us to assess us, to help us to see the right way, the straight way, the good way, the true, the beautiful. So a great teacher is helping us to see ourselves and to become self-assessors, and to even in time to be our own teachers, therefore, and to be able to correct ourselves, to learn how to learn, we might say. So I would just argue from the beginning that assessment is a very good thing, but there are ways of assessment that can be good or bad. There are ways in which we can adopt views of assessment that might not be appropriate to the skill or the student who is before us. In fact, sometimes we might simply be using the wrong method or the wrong instrument by which we are trying to see and set a student on a good path. So we'll talk about that. So we want to understand assessment traditionally. We want to understand it anthropologically, which is what we just did. We kind of looked at the fact that as human beings, this is how things work. We should also just remember that in the classical tradition, we learn much about what assessment is by looking at the context of the other components of the classical tradition. So I throw up this puzzle again just to remind us that these larger elements, these additional elements in the classical tradition, will give us context and guidance as we try to recover classical traditional means of assessing our students. So we could look at the fact that human beings have souls. If human beings have souls, that piece there in the top left-hand corner, we need to pay attention as teachers not just to how well the Latin is being translated, but also to the state of the soul of our students and thinking about how a soul is cultivated. How do we assess that? That might not be so easy to do with a multiple choice exam. And yet, if we take it as our responsibility that we are to help in the cultivation of a student's soul, we must be looking for means of assessing how that's going. So part of what we need to do with assessment is properly fit the means of assessment with that which we are assessing. We'll talk about that. We could look at another aspect, say, of the classical tradition by looking at this puzzle, and we could look at the great ideas. We know that in the classical tradition, we value the study of the greatest that's been thought and said, entering into the great conversation. Well, that means someone has to help us to understand these great ideas. We need someone to give us that skill and ability and then to assess how well we're acquiring the skills, say, of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, which help us to understand the great books. And of course, we need these great ideas in some sense to be our assessors, because as we read something that is true and good in a great book, that should be a kind of standard by which we look at our own lives. How well do we measure up to these standards of the true, the good, and the beautiful, these ideals that we read about in the great literature, and who is going to guide us in that process? In fact, if you think about it, anytime a teacher is guiding, he must at the same time be assessing. Because if one of the things that a teacher is to do is to set us upon a proper course or path, that teacher has to know when we possibly are stepping off the path and what it looks like, even if it's a small step in the wrong direction. I remember a pilot saying once that if a pilot who makes a flight plan to fly, say, from Orlando to Boston makes a miscalculation of just 2 degrees off, by the time he's traveled, say, 600 miles or so, he'll miss the airport by a wide shot. So who's going to be able to see and assess even when we are just off by a small degree that could result in a larger error down the road? Well, it's the great masters who can do this, the masters who can see what we can't see. The masters who have already gone through the steps that we have to walk through to attain mastery and can tell when we have taken a misstep and set us back on the right course. So assessment and teaching go hand in hand. They occur simultaneously. So just to mention by context, we need to know the larger tradition. The larger tradition is going to help us. And as we read the tradition of assessment, we read about assessment in the classical tradition, I think we'll find much of value and much to encourage us. So let me just mention a few sources. There is a PDF that you can download called The History of Grading Practices, written some decades ago by Louise Whitmer Curitin. But it's a great kind of short piece of 7 or 8 pages that will really help you quickly get the context of the history of grading. And then there's a book I'd like to mention. It's called Grading and Marking in American Schools, 2 Centuries of Debate, by John A. Laska and Tina Juarez. If you can find this online, this can be helpful. It's an anthology of traditional writings about grading practices, including going all the way back to, say, the late 1800s or early mid-1800s. You can read people like Horace Mann talking about new ideas for assessment and grading in the 19th century. and many modern writers as well in that anthology. So we'll look at the tradition. We'll assume that in order for us to go forward in the renewal of the classical tradition, recovering the evergreen ideas that never really have grown old, but maybe have been neglected to our detriment, we will find great wisdom there. We will go forward by restoring some of the practices and ideas from the past. We would do well just to remember what classical education is. If you happen to be viewing this video before you've done a study of what classical education is, I would encourage you maybe to just stop the video and take a course on the Introduction to Classical Education, either the one that I offer or the Liberal Arts Tradition course on Classical U would be a better course perhaps to take first. But here is classical education defined for you in a brief statement, kind of dictionary style. Classical education is a traditional approach to education rooted in Western civilization and culture, employing the historical curriculum and pedagogy of the 7 liberal arts in order to cultivate men and women characterized by wisdom, virtue, and eloquence. Now, as we consider even this definition, we should ask the question, what does this have to do with assessment? Well, if it's our goal that men and women would be characterized by wisdom, virtue, and eloquence, well, then we need to think about how we would know if that's occurring. What does it look like for a student to grow in wisdom, virtue, and eloquence? Those are very important questions to ask. Or if we were to look even at the liberal arts, if students are going to be trained in the liberal arts, say grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the trivium arts, and arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, the quadrivium arts, how will we know how students are progressing in the study of those arts? Those are questions, of course, that we should ask as teachers and assessors. So even the definition of classical education is already begging this question. Well, how would we know if we're actually doing what this definition suggests we should be doing? Here are what I consider to be some foundational questions that will be the context for our discussion of assessment and inform assessment. First of all, whom do we teach? Since we're teaching human beings, and human beings have souls, etc., and bodies, we should be asking the question, what are these enfleshed souls? What are humans? What is a human for? This is getting to our anthropology, and this points out to us that our philosophy and our theology are very important for educational practices. Teaching practices, pedagogies are going to follow from our anthropology. What do you think a human being is? And of course, I stand in the tradition of what we would call, say, Christian realism or philosophical realism. This is the idea that truth, goodness, beauty, the virtues are real. They truly exist independent of whatever we think of them. We don't create them out of our own heads. And that we are to conform ourselves to these ideals. As a Christian, I also believe that we're made in God's image, and that this is why we have the gift of language, the gift of being able to measure and quantify. The gift of being able to assess is also coming from the fact that we are human beings who are designed so that we can make judgments, wise judgments in time about what is true, good, and beautiful, and about whether a human being is growing in his understanding and apprehension and conformity to the true, the good, and the beautiful. To what end we teach is another question. I've already mentioned that the traditional ends of a classical education are wisdom, virtue, and eloquence. Well, it's an important question to ask as we consider assessment. What do we teach these students? Who teaches these students? In what setting do we teach? What do we assess? Ability, achievement, virtue, all of these? Do we assess against a standard of mastery? What is accessible and what's not? What is measurable, say using numbers, and what is not? What about time, capacity, and virtue? Assessment's going to take time. We can't really assess how a student is doing unless we can look at that student over time. What about capacity? Are we assessing capacity? Are we assessing virtue? These are important questions, and there have been two main historic approaches to these kinds of questions. One has been, in fact, to assess according to a standard of mastery. This is assessing with the assumption that there is a kind of already understood mastery of an art or a skill or mastered understanding of ideas, and that it's the teacher's job to help the student to acquire that understanding, acquire that skill, acquire that knowledge to a point where they are truly strong and maybe self-learners, self-teachers. That would be mastery. There's another approach, which is to assess according to other students' performance. In other words, comparative grading rather than mastery grading. This is grading on a curve, say. This is a kind of a grading system in which the student who has the highest grade in the class, even if he only answers 10 out of 50 questions correctly, would be the A student. It's a comparative study. This is when we are ranking students and trying to describe students in comparison to how other students are doing. Not everyone can get an A in this particular method. The mastery approach says you have mastered a body of knowledge, or you've mastered a set of skills, or you've mastered the understanding of a set of important ideas. Comparison says, the approach to assessment that is comparison says you have distinguished yourself among your peers. Now note that we can also grade or assess using a combination of these two. So you probably have gone through an education in which part of what you did, part of the way you were assessed was by mastery and part by comparison. For example, if you received some kind of designation, like in many high schools where if you were a part of the National Honor Society, you get to wear a certain tassel, or if you had a certain GPA, you got to wear a certain tassel, that would be comparison grading, where you're ranked above your peers for that GPA. If you've gone through a college where you were taking a chemistry course in which everybody was graded on a curve, that would have been comparison grading. The word adsidere means to sit down beside. Sedere means to sit down. Adsidere means to sit down beside someone, as it were, right next to someone. It can therefore mean to attend or assist. Why do I mention this Latin verb adsidere? I mention adsidere because the perfect passive is assessum or adsessum. And it can also mean to judge. It can also mean to come next to a judge. You think about it. If you, in the ancient world, if you were going to be judged, you might have to come before the judge in their minds, and maybe actually practically and literally sit down beside the judge, who would then render a judgment. But notice there's a positive connotation to this word as well, to attend and to assist. So that person, the good judge, the wise judge, would be your master or teacher by whom you would sit, who would give you thoughtful assistance and assessment. So even in the etymology of the Latin, the Latin word that is behind assessment, there is this idea of a very helpful assistance and attending to as well. There's also a negative connotation. You can think about going to before a judge and receiving a harsh judgment, maybe a sentence you didn't want to hear. But I like the fact that there's also a very positive connotation that comes from this word as well. The word mastery itself is derived from the Latin word magister. Magister was the word for captain of a ship or a teacher. We get the word magistrate and magisterial from magister. To become like your teacher. This is what Christ says in Luke 6:40, that when a student has been fully trained, he will become like his magister, will become like his teacher. Mastery is to become like your master. So in the classical tradition, again thinking of this master-apprentice-like relationship, the teacher is seeking to reproduce himself or herself in students. Mastery is becoming like the master. The master himself or herself seeking to form the student according to a form or standard. So when the master has, say, mastered grammar or mastered rhetoric, knowing that mastery, he seeks to bring his students or her students in conformity to those forms or standards of mastery. The magister or master therefore knows what is the larger end of education. The larger end of education we've already described. It's wisdom, eloquence, and virtue. Those are the high ends that a classical teacher is thinking about and seeking to conform his students to. And of course the master knows the art which he or she is teaching. Say it's rhetoric. If you're studying rhetoric, there will be some factual knowledge that must be mastered. There will be skills. There will be the understanding of ideas, rhetorical theory, and training in wise choices or judgment. That art of rhetoric is something the master knows and knows how to impart. Andrew Kern makes a point, and I think he's right on to do this. He makes a point of saying that assessment in the classical tradition should be a blessing. It should not be a harsh sentence reality. It should be a blessing. He says that, first of all, assessment should be prompt, and he's speaking mainly of correction here, that kind of assessment that is setting a student upon the path that he should be upon. This correction should be prompt, it should be personal, it should be loving, and it should be practical or actionable. Now, later on, you'll see a video where Andrew talks about this, but I think it's worth highlighting right now. When we assess, to bless other students, we should do it quickly. We should do it as soon as we see a student step off the path. We should be helping that student to step on the path. So we should correct and set a student right promptly, immediately if possible. It should be personal. So this again gets to the idea of an apprentice-master relationship. It ought not to be simply a comment we make before a class of 35 students. There may be a place for that from time to time, but the more personal the correction can be, the more effective it's going to be. And of course it should be loving, because we're seeking to help a student. We do love the student, and helping them to step back on the right path, right on the right course, is going to be a very loving thing to do anyway. And it should be practical. We should be helping the student to know what step to take next that's going to be most helpful to that student. As Andrew likes to say, it's not so important where you are, how much you know, how much skill you have presently. What's important is knowing what to do next. So these are the ways that assessment can be a blessing. I've already touched upon the idea of mastery and mentorship in the classical tradition. I like the idea and even the ideal of what happens when we teach our children a musical instrument via a teacher. If you send your daughter to a violin teacher, I doubt that your violin teacher is going to be giving too many multiple choice examinations or having your daughter take the national violin test online. But what she will be doing is coaching directly that student, working with her, giving her prompt and personal feedback, hopefully loving and actionable or practical feedback to help your daughter to improve as a violinist. And probably when you pick up your daughter from the violin lesson and want to know how she is doing, you won't be asking for a GPA, a grade point average, or a percentage score. Your violin teacher is probably not going to say, well, it was an 88 this week. Instead, she will use a variety of different kinds of words to describe the progress of your daughter towards some skill, maybe a discrete skill that she's seeking to master. Mastering that skill along with another skill leads to a general mastery later on. Mastery, mentorship, coaching, the personal interaction and care. This is the best of the classical tradition of assessment. Again, just to pull back for a moment and look at this issue from a higher altitude, these 8 principles of pedagogy also provide important context for how we assess. Now, on Classical U, there is a course on these essential principles of classical pedagogy. But just look at some of them. Look, for example, at multum non multa, which means much not many. It's better to do a deep study of a few things than to do a superficial, shallow study of a lot of things, right? How does that relate to assessment? Well, we want to assess for a deep understanding of an idea or a work of literature, say, or a concept that's being taught. In fact, C.S. Lewis says that one of the mistakes we make, he says this in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, one of the mistakes that teachers often make is to teach too many things to a student. And he says, if we teach too many subjects at once, too many arts at once, too many books at once to a student, what do? Well, among other things, he says, we deprive them of a taste for mastery. We deprive them of the opportunity of ever mastering an art because we're requiring them to study too many things at once. If you think about this in your high school or junior high experience, maybe even your college experience, if you had to study 8 or 9 different subjects at once through high school, you realize that you were never going to achieve mastery in any one of them. This is why we always are astonished when we meet a student who has mastered something by the time he or she's 18. So if we meet a high school student at age 17 or 18 who shows mastery of the violin, we are astonished. How is this possible? We know that it took a long obedience in one direction for that to happen. But what happens to that student who does master even just the violin? She acquires, according to Lewis, a taste for mastery. She knows what it's like to walk in one direction a long way and master something. And having mastered the violin, what is the likelihood that she might master something else? It increases dramatically because having mastered one thing, she knows what it is like. She has a taste for mastery. She knows what it's like to master the next thing. So just that one principle of multum non multa is very much related to assessment. We would do far better to assess for a deep knowledge of a few things rather than a superficial knowledge of a lot of things. Now, we could look at some of these other principles, and if we had time, we could tease out the way that, say, wonder and curiosity or the educational virtues are related to assessment. I've already mentioned that if we're seeking to cultivate virtues, we have to be thinking about how we would assess how that is happening. What would it look like? What kind of instruments would we use to measure that? Well, now to talk about the history of ancient grading more directly. You should know this. I think it'll be helpful. One is, there's no record of a formal grading system like the ones we have now in the ancient world. There certainly wasn't the A, B, C, D, F system. It's also true that there was a good bit of punishment in the ancient world for failing to show learning. This Latin phrase, manum ferulae subducere, essentially means, give me a stick. There were punishments and threats. In fact, Augustine says this, reflecting on his own education. He says, "Who is there who would not recoil in horror and choose death if he was asked to choose between dying or going back to his childhood?" Reflecting on his education. But rewards were also encouraged. In fact, the Roman poet Horace says that young children should be offered cakes in the forms of the letters that they are learning for good work completed. So the carrot and the stick, rewards and punishments, have been around for some time. Even in the ancient world, they were quite prevalent. Competition was often encouraged, sometimes even rivalry between boys in a school setting. Teacher recommendations were a very important, if not primary, means of assessment. what your masters thought of you and what they said to others was really important. So think in terms of letters of recommendation. If Augustine did really well in some of his secondary education, he would get a recommendation from his masters that would enable him to find a nice place training in higher education later. That's the way it would work. Letters of recommendation. Education was for the elite and aristocratic classes only, and for many centuries, maybe 5 to 10% of the population would have opportunity, wealth, and freedom to even get a good education. Often education was in smaller classes than we would think of them today, even tutorials. Education was literary and non-servile, and it was designed to humanize those who were being studied. So when we think of a liberal arts education, we're thinking of the education for the free person to stay free, and the person who also had the freedom, the opportunity, the luxury, you might say, of even getting a good education. Later there was a dialectical and philosophical and rhetorical and professional education, say in medicine and law. But for the most part, prior to, say, the advent of the universities in 1100s, education was primarily a liberal arts education, and professional training occurred before, alongside, or afterwards. What were your credentials as a student? The teacher that you had. Who did you study with? The school you went to were your chief credentials. And of course, a letter of recommendation that you might be able to take with you. In the medieval period, we can say as well that there was no record of a formal grading system, nothing like we know now. There were some assessment designation towards the end of a study, like cum laude, summa cum laude. These kinds of Latin phrases were used in various contexts to describe good work. But notice that words were used and not numbers. Recommendations continued to be really important in the medieval period. The small classes and tutorials in small schools were, again, the way in which education was conducted. When we think of the large high school in America, we're thinking about a historical anomaly. I've already mentioned that only a very small percentage of the population could even get an education in the ancient period, and this is true largely in the medieval period as well. And schools and classes were small, very small compared to what we think of. Education was often a mentorship and an apprenticeship. Because the classes were small, because the students were known, the relationship between teacher and student could be more personal, more dynamic. Small groups of students and small groups of teachers. In the Renaissance, we still don't have a formal system of grading like we're used to thinking about now in our contemporary period. There was an extension of the medieval system with a turn back to the springs of knowledge from the Greeks and Romans, ad fontes, back to the fountains of ancient learning. The universities began to grow, having been founded, say, in the 1100s. Places like the University of Paris and Oxford, etc., grow to become very large institutions, relatively speaking. Not so large compared to what we're thinking about. There were no universities with 45,000 students, say, attending. There were still small schools, small classes. There were some designations that were used in the Renaissance period and Reformation period to describe what students needed to do. For example, the Jesuits had just 2 designations, and they started some 800 schools and colleges, beginning with around 1540 with Ignatius Loyola as part of the Counter-Reformation. Well, the Jesuits' designations were adequate and surpassing adequacy. That's really all they were looking for in a student, is to be doing adequate work or doing above and beyond what they considered to be adequate work. If a student did not do adequate work, that student would need to repeat the study. You might call that a pass-fail designation. There were periodic evaluations. There were final assessments that we might call pass-fail assessments in order for a teacher, for example, to receive a credential of a Master of Arts, an MA, there would be some examinations that young man would need to go through in order to be qualified to be a Master of the Arts, qualified to teach in any of the 7 liberal arts. Well, now to just bring us up to speed and talk about grading from 1800 to present, the first person, at least in many records, that is thought to have established a grading system is William Farish in 1792, a chemist from Cambridge University, and he created a scale for grading. In 1785, we see some kinds of designations on a 4-point scale of optimi, meaning the best, second optimi, the second best, the inferiores, and the peores. The inferiores would be inferior, and the peores would be means the worst. So the best, second best, the inferior, and the worst. Class rankings begin to occur at this time. There were 3 designations in 1891 that we read about: high, medium, and deficient. We see designations like distinguished, approved, disapproved, and passed, conditioned, and not passed. In 1901, a 3-scale definition or designation. We even find in 1891 an example of a 6 designation. These are all from American universities: optimus, melior, bonus, malus, peor, and pessimus. That means the best, better, good, bad, worse, and the worst. Teachers were examined and graded annually with written tests, and they were often graded before even their students were. And a 100-point scale was sometimes used to examine teachers. Some of these teacher examinations were even public, where the public was invited to watch these teachers being examined. And if a teacher didn't pass the exam, he would no longer be allowed to teach in that school. In 1895, the University of Michigan had these designations: passed, incomplete, not passed, conditional, and absent. It was in 1897 that Mount Holyoke College, a women's college in Massachusetts, first used the A, B, C, D designations along with an E. Eventually, the E is going to fall off and just be replaced with an F, because F conveniently could stand for failure. Starch and Elliott write in 1912, the research in 1912 proved that subjectivity and wide variance in grading practices existed. And they did this by sending the same kind of essay questions to multiple teachers, asking these teachers from around the country to grade a particular test and the answers on those tests, and they found that the variation in the way grading occurred from teacher to teacher around the country was wide. In the early 1900s, we begin to see grading on the curve emerging. Winfield Scott Hall in 1906 did some study and showed that and argued that grades should resemble anthropometric data. What he means by this is he thinks that since there's a kind of standard curve of measurements that we can find when we measure, say, the size of a human skull or the size of a human foot, essentially following the bell curve, with some people having very large heads, just a few, and very few people having very small heads, and a large group in the middle having kind of what we might call various forms of medium-sized heads. He thought that that should be the case with academic ability and capacity, and therefore academic outputs or outcomes as well. He expected to see the bell curve being manifested in any large enough group of students who are being assessed. This becomes very powerful and persuasive to many, and a grading on the curve begins to occur, and looking for bell curve outcomes becomes more and more popular. In the second lecture, I'm going to explore that in some detail. Max Meyer, a theorist, writes in 1908, "Education is just beginning to realize that it is not merely an art, but an applied science." Another thing that happens is that in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s, there is massive immigration into the United States. It's at the same time when social science is starting to come into its own. Educational psychology is going to be born, sociology. And we begin to think that we can, in fact, turn education into a science, move it from an art to a science. This is when education begins to argue for itself to become an approved and esteemed academic discipline in the universities. And it had to fight for that right, because education was not considered to be a discipline as such, but an art that wasn't really a subject to be studied at the university level. But the rise of psychology, educational psychology, sociology, and social science will change all that. Remember, this was the time in the late 1900s. You know, the locomotive had been invented, the car had been invented, the steam engine. There were all kinds of remarkable scientific discoveries emerging, and people thought that we could apply the same kind of scientific thinking and success to education, teaching, and learning. But massive immigration meant that schools were going to multiply in size very quickly. This is what Brian Palmer says, even recently writing for Slate magazine online. Schools at the turn of the century were bursting at the seams, given the sudden increase in immigration and the rise of compulsory attendance laws. Teachers and administrators needed an efficient, standardized system for testing and evaluating large numbers of students. Another marvel of efficiency, the multiple choice exam, was invented at the beginning of the century as well. So this move towards standardization and efficiency, evaluating large numbers of students, becomes very important. And I think we could say almost necessary. What would you do if schools were growing this fast? For example, here's what Nicolin Lawson says. The number of public high schools increased from 500 to 10,000 between 1870 and 1910. These changes made the use of written descriptive reports, teacher recommendations, and narratives of student work, for example. These changes made the use of written descriptive reports less feasible, and high schools increasingly began using both percentage and letter grades to evaluate students. What the colleges had already begun to do with their designations, the high schools began to emulate and do as well. So there was this big move towards efficiency, this big move towards trying to manage large numbers of students. So coping with these very large numbers is going to lead to assessment methods that are quantifiable, that are easily transferable, and that would mean numbers. It's because of the rise of large industry, scientific discovery, the rise of social science, that we begin to think in terms of metrics and quantifying exams that are transferable, and eventually with the invention of the computer, machine readable. The World War I and the Army's serviceman exam also becomes a very influential contributor to mental testing as a part of the way that we will do assessment, standardized assessment and aptitude assessment, mental testing assessment. These are going to become very popular after World War I. Why? Because there was a big exam. A lot of the social scientists, educational psychologists derived an aptitude test for men who were going to serve in the Army during World War I. And this test was designed to try to help track and slot where these soldiers would best serve in the Army. And it was considered to be revolutionary and successful enough that it could be applied to education generally. So the thought was, we can change education now with these new tools. And because of massive immigration, we need some new tools. We can change education and transform it into a science. And to quote Max Meyer once more, in 1908, education is just beginning to realize that it is not merely an art, but an applied science. This is a good way to cap off this first lecture. This is what is behind a lot of modern grading today in our own schools. This move towards seeking to transform education from an art to a science. And we'll explore whether or not that is actually a wise move or not in the second lecture I'll see you then. Hi, this is Chris.
I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. And all my days I've been held in your hand. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God.